Hi, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all. I am the environmental justice lecturer in the Earth Systems program, and I've been here for about a year and a half. And so my research interest is in the energy transition and its impact on Africa, and really thinking about large-scale clean energy projects and how it relates to justice, and also thinking about critical minerals and mining and how that also relates to justice, and thinking about the network of power and economic relations related to the supply chain for the energy transition. And so I'm really kind of also interested in the kind of, I call it my praxis. And so I do work in Ghana, and I'm really interested in decentralized solar systems through local manufacturing. And so really thinking about how we can expand solar access, but also thinking about these kind of intersections and networks which can also expand energy, right? Thinking about job creation, energy research, STEM education, right? Combining all of that into systems in which we're also expanding energy access, and also transnational research partnerships. So that's a little bit of a background on me. So if we think about sustainable energy, right, in the 21st century and beyond, we can kind of break it down into kind of these four areas of accessibility, affordability, protective, and security as major concerns. And so when we think about accessibility, right, we can think about things like reliability. We can think about the business losses that are associated with a lack of energy. And so again, I do my work in Ghana, so I'll be referencing Ghana. And we can think also about, let me just put this map up really quick, right? So the share of population with access to electricity, we see that when we're thinking about energy access in the developing world and global south, the biggest crisis area really is in sub-Saharan Africa. And so we can think about Ghana, which loses an average of $2.1 million daily due to electricity losses. We can think about things like the usefulness of energy, productive uses, like as some people were mentioning, food storage, right? Other ways to increase agricultural production through energy use. And also really thinking about equitable. So energy use, how do we ensure that energy use is evenly distributed and accessible, particularly to people who are living in poverty and also living in rural areas. When we think about affordability, we have to think about the predictability of the energy systems. For example, again in Ghana, and Ghana is an example that we can use that is representative of many challenges across sub-Saharan Africa, and that you have a problem of what is called load shedding, which usually is associated with either a shortage of electricity or an overloading of the grid. And that is a common problem that happens. And so that inhibits the idea of having a predictable system. We can think about this idea of competitiveness. If the price of energy is too high, then people will continue to use biofuels and other more polluting energy sources. And so that actually becomes a really big challenge in terms of expanding access in Africa as well. If you have populations that are living on $3 to $5 a day, oftentimes you have the state subsidizing the energy. And that also then does not mean that your electricity system is actually somehow competitive. So there's a hesitance sometimes for private investment into systems where there's a subsidy on electricity. Resilient, right? We can definitely think in terms of climate change and extreme weather events. So to what extent is the energy infrastructure actually resilient? and capable of actually withstanding damage that can result from extreme weather events. And again, related to this idea of competitive, right, profitable. And so that kind of also, we can think about the question of, is energy a human right? Right? So to what extent do we think about energy as a human right versus energy as something that is profitable? And then thinking about national security. So national interests can include a peaceful society. And so when energy systems are not in place, that can lead to unrest due to economic concerns. It can lead to high unemployment. And we hope that the national security goals of most countries is to ensure an equitable society. And so that would reduce the likelihood of conflict. And so that would mean ensuring that you have a stable energy access. And when we can think of protective, right, air quality. Air pollution is the second leading risk factor for death in the world. And so when people are using kerosene lanterns, when we have energy infrastructure like refineries located near communities and things like that, we are increasing the risks of those communities. Climate change, obviously, right? So we have to think about the clean energy transition and carbon emissions due to oil and natural gas production and weigh these risks with the expansion of energy. And water resources. And so when we think about energy systems, let's say nuclear energy uses a tremendous amount of water. We can think of green hydrogen as well. It uses a tremendous amount of water, lithium mining. So a lot of these energy systems are related to water use and water resources and water pollution as well. We can think about the Fukushima nuclear meltdown, right? And so there was a release of water into the ocean in Japan, which was very controversial as people are thinking about water uses and energy. And of course, these are all related to ecosystems. We can think about oil production and other ways that fragile ecosystems are being degraded due to our need for energy. And so these are all things that we kind of have to think about and balance as we're thinking about building a sustainable energy system for the future. So I'm very interested in justice, right? There's a difference between energy access and energy justice. And so when we think about what does an energy system look like in a just society, right, we have to think about things like procedural and distributive justice and energy histories. So what do I mean by that? So we want an energy system where when people are really equitably sharing both the benefits and the burdens involved in the production and the consumption of energy sources and energy services. We also have to think about the entire supply chain, right, and production chain of energy, right? So who might be disproportionately impacted by pollution, by this energy production, and in what ways can we try to account for that to ensure that just systems actually exist. And so we can think about things like procedural justice, how decisions are made. And so in our energy systems that exist today, oftentimes we have very much of a top-down, right, decision-making process that does not necessarily include the communities that are most impacted by energy systems. And so a just system, if we look at in the framework of energy justice, a just system means that local forms of knowledge are actually centered in these planning processes. And so when we're thinking about what do we think about energy systems and just systems in the 21st century, this is a question I think is a very important question that needs to be posed, again, thinking in terms of energy access versus energy justice. Because I think for the most part, in a democratic system, right, we want to have a system that is particularly just. We can think about distributive justice, as I mentioned, right, how benefits and burdens are distributed, and also energy histories, the historical production of inequalities. I'll take an example from the United States to talk about energy histories. So again, as we look at this map, right, we see the United States as essentially a share of population with access to energy is about 100%. But if we disaggregate that data and we drill down, we see that we have about 16% of American households that experience what is called energy poverty when you're spending more than 6% of your household income on energy bills. We also see that in areas where we have indigenous populations, right, we have an estimated 17,000 tribal homes with no electricity. Right? So even though we're saying we have 100% access in the United States, we have these energy burdens that are disproportionately impacting Native American populations. We can relate that back to these ideas of energy histories, right? And we understand the way in which these communities have been marginalized. It has not been the in terms of expanding energy access into these areas has not been a priority. And so we can think about that idea of energy histories to actually understand why some areas and some communities are not able to have access to energy. And then as you see, tribal communities experience 6.5 times more electricity outages per year than the national average. Also, when we think about energy justice, we're also thinking about, again, this idea of distributional justice, right? The burdens and the benefits of the energy system. So this is a map of what is called, this is called Cancer Alley, like this whole part here. Anybody know why this is called Cancer Alley? Have you heard of this area before? This is in Louisiana. Yes?
It's called Cancer Alley due to high levels of petrochemicals and air pollution, which are causing high rates of cancer in that area.
Exactly. And so the people in this area are experiencing these negative health outcomes at the same time experiencing high levels of energy poverty. And so we see these ideas of, distributional justice right here in the United States, even though when we typically think about energy access problems, we think about it in the developing world. Let's get into kind of the idea of what are the benefits of energy consumption and how do we kind of measure this or think about this as people have more access to energy. And so on the top, right, we have energy consumption measured in gigajoule per year per person. And so on the low end, we see around 20 gigajoules per year per person, biomass being used, right, cooking for warmth and cooking and water and things like that, so meeting your basic needs. And then as you move up, you're enhancing productivity, right, using maybe solar pumps, solar dryers, then moving up to enhancing your quality of life through modern waterway systems, right? And so as we see that as you increase your energy availability and the energy quality, you see this increasing quality of life. And so we can also see the ways in which energy is related to the Human Development Index. And so the Human Development Index was actually created because it was actually Amartya Sen, who's a philosopher, and really was thinking about the ways in which GDP doesn't capture quality of life. And so the Human Development Index is looking at life expectancy, education inequality, and gross national income, right? Rather than just looking at the total amount of goods and services a country might produce per year. So really thinking about how do we understand and measure quality of life. So you can see per capita income, right, decent standard of living, schooling, access to knowledge, long, healthy life, right, things like that. And so when we look at the Human Development Index, when we think about the energy access, right, and you map on energy access to the HDI, we also see these connections between energy access and Human Development Index. But at the same time, when we think about this connection or the relationship between HDI and energy use per capita, again, in gigajoules, what pattern might you see, right, in this chart? What is this chart telling us?
This chart represents diminishing marginal returns. When you add a little energy per capita, you see huge increases in HDI. But after a certain point, HDI stops increasing even if the energy per capita is increased.
Exactly. So around 100 gigajoules, once you get to that point, right, you have this HDI measures are not necessarily increasing due to an increase in energy use per capita. So we really want to make sure that folks are able to get around, about 100 gigajoules per capita per year. And obviously when we think about the United States, right, and our overconsumption, right, that's not necessarily relating to a better health outcomes, as we know, for our decreasing life expectancy over time is not related to our energy consumption here at all. So we can also think about the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you probably are very familiar with, and all the ways that energy is related to actually all of these sustainable energy goals, the development goals, right? Affordable and clean energy, which is related to poverty, which is related to hunger, which is related to good health and well-being, which is related to education, gender inequality, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, clean water and sanitation, decent work, industry and infrastructure, reducing inequalities, right, climate action. And also, even though these aren't circled, we know that sustainable cities and communities, you need energy, right? You need to think about life below water, as I was speaking about the use of water in, whether it's nuclear, or lithium, or all of these ways that we are producing energy, right, that, or even desalination, which is required for green hydrogen projects, which produces a large amount of brine, which can also impact the fisheries. Life on land, we can think about, even in terms of renewable energy, the amount of land it takes to actually produce large-scale solar that can also be contested, because oftentimes, and particularly in the United States, these areas that are cited can be on native land. And so we also have to think about those things. And peace, justice, and strong institutions, as I mentioned, right, oftentimes we can link energy and the lack of energy to political disruption. All right, so affordable and clean energy goals. And we can really think about this. Again, I'm very interested in this idea of justice. So I feel like we always have to think about these ideas of justice. So ensuring universal access and affordable, reliable, and modern energy services in the framework of justice. Right? Increase substantially the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. But again, thinking about procedural justice and distributive justice. Enhancing international cooperation to facilitate access to clean energy research and technology, including renewable energy, energy efficiency, and advanced and cleaner fossil fuel technology, and promote investment in energy infrastructure and clean energy technology. And what I'll talk about a little bit later is this idea of international cooperation and research should also be something that is democratic as well. And so it should not necessarily just come from the West in terms of determining the research goals and the technology goals. And expanding infrastructure and upgrading technology for supplying modern and sustainable energy services for all in developing countries, in particularly least developed countries and landlocked countries, right? So how do we think about these ideas of infrastructure and technology upgrades? They're actually quite complicated, as I'll talk a little bit more about Ghana as an example. And also, right, one of the most difficult places to actually electrify are rural areas, as I'm sure most of you know. When we think about energy access, also we can link these questions to climate change as well. And so going back to this map, again, we're thinking about where's the areas that have the lowest in terms of the HDI index, countries that don't have access to energy, and countries that are most vulnerable to climate change, and the countries that are least responsible for CO2 emissions. And so we see these challenges in terms of, again, going back to sub-Saharan Africa, where we see that they are the least responsible for CO2 emissions, but are really the most vulnerable to climate change. And again, kind of going back to these ideas of energy justice, how do we explain some of these challenges? And we can think about this idea of energy histories as a way that we can kind of begin to think about why there is such little access in sub-Saharan Africa. And so there, actually in this past year, the Nobel laureates in economics actually were looking at the importance of social institutions for a country's prosperity related to colonialism. And so there are these three economists, Dena Montague, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson, have shown that differences in countries' prosperity were really we can trace that back to the introduction of colonialism. And so they show in their work that some countries became trapped in a situation where extractive institutions and low economic growth became almost like path dependent. And so when we think about the idea of energy production in the colonial sense, there's also Mahmoud Mamdani, a scholar who talks about this idea of late colonialism in Africa. So when we think about independence, independence began around 1960, whereas many other countries in the global south had already achieved independence, and then up into the 1990s. So we have countries like Namibia that gained its independence in 1990. And so the colonial project was very interested in that extractive process, and so energy was concentrated in the extractive industries. And so really wasn't cited for the larger population. And so we also see issues in terms of structural adjustment and debt, which also hinder the ability to expand energy access. So for example, the IMF structural adjustment policy, which is essentially where a country might be in economic crisis, goes to the IMF. The IMF begins to design an economic plan for that country. And oftentimes we see, and this is the case of Ghana just this year, that part of that IMF structural adjustment could be to reduce subsidies and also increase prices for energy. And so that means that there's actually less, so that builds in kind of what we start to see in the trend of IMF structural adjustment is increased inequality. And also, when we think about these ideas of global inequality, and procedural justice. Oftentimes, these countries are not part of the IEA, and so they're not necessarily at the table in terms of what does global energy policy look like. And so these are some of the ways we can think about energy histories. This is a very charged question. I think for the work I do, because obviously I'm working from a justice perspective, is to try to increase energy access without relying on fossil fuels. But as I said, this is yes and no's, right? This is a vibrant debate that's happening. So really thinking about framing fossil-free energy justice. One, we see across sub-Saharan Africa, where we have the most critical energy needs, that we have a thriving civil society that's actually saying no to fossil fuels. So you actually see this divide oftentimes between the state that is arguing that it's not possible to go straight to renewable, right? That is arguing that there needs to be more of a bridge. And then you have a civil society that's saying, no. There's actually a thriving organization that's called Don't Gas Africa. And so oftentimes what they're arguing is that if you take the example of, let's say, Nigeria, which is a major oil producer, there's no real connection between producing more oil and energy access, right? So their energy access has not really expanded over time, even though they are a major oil producer. And what is actually happening is you're seeing a lot of pollution, and environmental degradation that's related to the oil production. You also are seeing in terms of employment that usually in these sectors, there's a very small number of people who are involved in the actual industry. And so they're not really seeing that it's linked to expanding employment opportunities as well. We have people like Mark Jacobson, which maybe some of you know, he's arguing that this idea of no miracles needed, right? That we can actually use today's technology, wind, water, and solar, and that we have, essentially what he's saying, we have 95% of the technology we need. Mark Jacobson, who teaches here, right? And so that's what he's saying, is that we actually we achieve these energy transitions by committing to 100% renewable. We also have an economist, Kate Raworth, who talks about this idea of donut economics, right? So really taking the relationship with the economy and the biosphere seriously. I'll just go to this. This is one of the charts that she presents. And her argument is that we have an economy that's not necessarily thinking about our planetary boundaries. And so her argument is that we need to start shifting our understanding of what the economy is for, right? Her argument is that the economy in this 21st century, when we're dealing with the climate crisis, we should not be centering GDP and thinking about production as the main measure of economic growth. What we should be thinking about is how does our economy work in terms of ensuring that we're within our planetary boundaries, right? That we're not going past our ecological ceiling, and that we're also creating these kind of social foundations at the same time. We could relate that to the HDI. And so if this is a way that we think about the economy, then it makes obviously more sense to ensure that we have a clean energy transition so that we are not blowing past our ecological boundaries and also emitting CO2 emissions, and then the climate vulnerability risk of the global south. So there's another thing that the civil society is saying, is that if we are actually increasing the production of fossil fuels, then these countries that are already tremendously vulnerable to climate risk will then experience, increase the disproportionate impact of extreme climate events in these countries that are that would be producing more fossil fuels to increase energy access. And so those are some of the ways we can kind of frame these ideas of energy justice within understanding an increase in energy access. How are countries supposed to, and again, my focus is mostly on sub-Saharan Africa, that's why I keep talking about it, right? How are you supposed to increase energy access in this way that we have talked about? We're saying the majority of the class is saying that it is possible to do it through renewable energy, but we know that the rest of the world did it through coal. That's much cheaper, right? And so much less complicated. And so then what happens? But we also see that there's this kind of steady 600 million without electricity in sub-Saharan Africa. So even though you have an increase with the population with electricity, it's really difficult over time to actually make a dent into the 600 million without electricity. And so how does this happen, right? And this kind of paradox kind of complicates things. At the same time, the continent has enormous solar potential. And so we kind of see from this map that if we were, I think part of the work that I'm doing is thinking about, like, how do we tap into this potential? How do we find ways that may essentially kind of leapfrog over existing ways in which we expand energy access that can really then ensure that you have clean, renewable energy for everybody. So when we go back to this issue in terms of using fossil fuels, we also see this is the current and planned gas production in Africa. And so we have gas pipelines, we have LNG terminals, we have oil and gas blocks. And we see, like, in the dark red is production, the pink is exploration, and the kind of off-white is potential licenses. And so we see the entire continent, in many ways, we see plans for oil and gas exploration. Oftentimes, this oil and gas exploration is really not for the benefit of the people on the continent. It is for export, right? And so even when we do have, let's say in Nigeria, right, which is around here, you see a lot of proposed and production going on as a major exporter. When they do, because there's a lack of refineries too, oftentimes they're exporting that crude and importing the refined oil and gas, which is also very expensive. And so we see these kind of tensions between this idea of the oil and gas, right, as opposed to the PV potential. And so, like, what direction can we go in? So I'm gonna talk a little more about Ghana because this is a place where I've been doing work for several years. And it's also an interesting case study because out of the continent, especially in West Africa, it's actually seen as a success story in terms of energy access. So you have about 86% of the country on paper that has energy access. And it's like one of the highest rates of energy access in West Africa. They actually also export energy to their neighboring countries in Ivory Coast, in Burkina Faso, and in Togo. But on the ground, it's a really different story, right? So we can even think about going back to that map when we're looking at the United States and we're seeing 100% energy access, and then we drill down, and then we start to see there are other challenges that are existing on the ground. We see that electricity generation in Ghana, despite the huge solar potential that we see, particularly in the northern areas where I work around Tamale, which is the third largest city in the country, right? We see that solar is less than 1% of the energy mix, right? So you have oil and natural gas, and you have hydro. Hydro was like the first energy that was established in Ghana. So I'll just go over a little bit of the evolution of electricity generation since 2000. And so we see hydro, it fluctuates a bit. I mean, this is also related to climate change, right, in terms of drought. We also see natural gas spiking. And that is related to their use of thermal. So they use not geothermal, but they use thermal energy, which requires natural gas. And because they started to cite more thermal in around 2016, we see this increase in natural gas. And as I was explaining before, like for the case of Nigeria, that because they lack the refinery capacity, it's often exported and then re-imported. And so that is led to a high level of debt for the energy sector. The other things that are challenging for Ghana is this Ghanaian term, which is a Twi, it's one of their languages term. It's called Dumsor. Dumsor means on and off. And so there are frequent power outages, and as I mentioned before, this causes millions of dollars in terms of lost revenue in businesses. You have an aging infrastructure, right? And again, that kind of goes back to the idea of the upfront capital to actually improve that infrastructure. You have growing demand with a growing population. You also have things like inaccurate reading and billing by existing meters, which actually then means that oftentimes that the bills are not paid, and so that leads to the growing debt in the energy sector as well. The reliance on thermal, as I mentioned, and the inadequate investment due to capital. And I mentioned the structural adjustment, which also increases the energy costs as well. And then the problems with renewable energy. We have a lot of imported low-quality panels that are on the market. And so not only that, you're telling your friends, like, I got this solar panel, and it's not even really, it just doesn't even work. And so that's a major problem. The other things is the high cost of solar, lack of repair and follow-up services, and also a need for robust policy. And so even though you might have some policy that's on the books, you have a problem in terms of actually implementing policies that would actually lead to more expansion of solar. So when we think about our solar PV options, right, we can think of the smallest, like is pico solar. We go to off-grid. We go to mini grids that you all were able to see. Another thing is that mini grids don't necessarily always work in these contexts. So it's important to actually think about what is the distribution of the population in terms of the benefit of mini grids. And so I did work in Burkina Faso, and it was really interesting on the ground. People would say, well, mini grids don't always work here. And so another thing, what is happening is that, again, when we think about this idea of procedural justice, if we're not hearing about what works on the ground, we often have international organizations that will then implement these projects that don't necessarily work. And when they don't work, then you're creating e-waste, right? You're creating also problems for the population, which is extremely common. And so what the work I do is really thinking about energy innovation from below. So how do we partner with engineers on the ground to actually develop these new energy systems? How do we think about things like the circular economy? Ghana is a place where there is the largest e-waste dump in the world. And so one of the things that we're doing, I'll just quickly go to that, is like instead of using, this is a project that we did last summer, right? Instead of using a lithium ion or lead acid battery, you can take batteries from e-waste. These are directly from Agbobashi, the largest e-waste dump in the world, probably our batteries, right? And you can create battery packs that reduce the cost, and then you're also dealing with a circular economy, right? These are ideas that start to generate from below. Designing to fit unique climate challenges. So we also see in Ghana and in the Sahel region issues of dust accumulation. And dust accumulation, this is one of our first installations. And then you can see during this period of time called Hamatan, which is incredibly dusty. And you see this panel covered in dust. And so when we installed this, people were like, wait, the panel's not working anymore. And it's like, because that dust can decrease energy generation by half. And so this is a common problem, but we do not have solar panels that are actually designed to deal with these climate challenges that impact the Sahel region, northern Ghana, and with climate change, as we're seeing the expansion of the desert, we're seeing these dust patterns also happening in Accra and other areas. So how do we address that? And so some of the things that we have been doing is thinking about how do you build a network of ground-based soiling measurements in West Africa. We have a lack of data also that's happening on the continent. This is also, if we don't understand the problem, then we can't really address the solution. And so with our teams, we created this ASMUNT, which really is able to then collect ground-based data on dust so that we can understand dust patterns and dust accumulation. And so then let's say if there's going to be a sighting of a large solar array, right? Where should you put that? If you don't understand where the dust accumulation is going to happen, then you could have problems. I actually was just talking to somebody recently about this, and they were saying in the Salton Sea, where we have large solar installations, that's actually a problem happening in California. And so they're actually bringing in water to wash down, right, in the desert, to wash down these solar panels. And so this is a problem that is, not just for Ghana. And so some of the folks that I'm working with are thinking about, then how do you then design new solar panels that can be dust resistant? And so this came from a recent Ph.D. graduate at MIT who works with us, who designed this panel for dust mitigation that could reduce dust accumulation by 60%. Now, if we're able to do something like that, and then you then start to site these solar panels, right, then you're going to have a higher likelihood that people will have trust in it and will understand and see that they actually work. Some of the other issues are thinking about value-added production. In some African countries, 90% of their economy is actually exporting raw materials. So how do you build up value-added production? And so we're thinking about also most of these countries all of them actually, are importing solar panels. So what happens when you start to build the solar panels themselves? That deals with labor issues, right? We have high unemployment amongst young people, especially engineers. And so what we're trying to do is essentially bring engineers, right, to build, when we're talking about building the solar panels, it's literally like building from components. And then how do we use as many locally sourced materials as possible, also helping the local economy. And this is also at a really cool art center, because I'm really interested in the intersection of art and science. And so when we do these kind of solar building demonstrations, we have people from all over the region that come to this art center just because it's a cool art center. And they're also able to see, like, oh, this is how solar is built. And so that also builds a level of trust. This picture I kind of like. This was like our first solar panel that we built, but he's wearing a t-shirt that says "Stop War." And as I said, when you have increased employment, right, and you have increased energy access, you're less likely to have conflict. And so that's also part of the thinking. And then building out decentralized access. And so this is a solar laminating system that the engineering team built, which basically standardizes and improves the quality of the solar systems. And this is something that could be replicated, right, in different areas in terms of decentralizing access. And so then if local people are actually engaged in that production, they know exactly what they need. And so that reduces the risk of what's happening now is sometimes it's just pure exploitation by people who are coming into these areas. And then also just thinking about creative uses. So like portable solar generators, this is part of the team, right? And they're thinking about, because the issues around reliability on energy, you have a lot of people using generators, right? And generators are very toxic. And so how do you reduce that reliability on generators that require fuel? All right, so that's a little bit of kind of the work I'm doing and the way I'm thinking about, right, when we go back to the original question, why is it so hard to expand solar access? And when we're thinking about the grid expansion and the types of investment you need, I'll just kind of briefly talk about, again, in terms of Ghana, their energy sector is $35 billion in debt. $35 billion. So how do you expand energy access when you have $35 billion in debt? And you have the World Bank recently said they want energy expansion in sub-Saharan Africa, so they're proposing $35 billion in loans, low interest loans. But when we think about $35 billion offered for the entire continent, you have $35 billion in debt in one country. And so, and their external debt is $44 billion. And then oftentimes we see that these countries are spending more on servicing their debt than actually money that's used for the social sector. And so it does become an interesting challenge to think about then how does that grid expansion work? And then so in terms of my own work, thinking about this decentralized access as a way that's more low cost to actually be able to expand that. And then as you know, right, Africa attracts only 2% of global investments in clean energy, but needs 2.8 trillion of investment by the sector. So it's by 2030. So it's a very complicated question about how to actually expand that energy. Okay, so we see microgrids, right? They can be very effective and very efficient, but again, it's really important in terms of the idea of procedural justice to know whether that community needs it. And if something happens to that microgrid, who can fix it? And so these are questions that need to be answered when we're thinking about these effective solar expansion. And we see, this kind of like gaining access through standalone solar systems over time. And then we also have to think about, as we were talking about rural areas, right, and that the lack of access in rural areas, we see that in many low-income economies that agriculture is the largest source of employment, so that over time we see increase in the service sector, the industry is remaining essentially stable. We see less employment in the agricultural sector, but in these developing countries, we're going to see higher rates of employment in the agricultural sector. So how do we think about using solar, right, and renewable energy as ways to increase agricultural productivity? This is a project that I worked on, and these are Stanford grads from a little while ago. This is in Burkina Faso, where we partnered with somebody who was thinking about how to increase poultry production. It's actually, this is in Burkina Faso, it's actually cheaper to buy a frozen chicken coming from the European Union than it is to buy a local chicken. Right? Why would that be? Part of it is policy, but part of it is the production of poultry itself. And so they use these things called these poultry incubators that are run on electricity. And so you put your eggs in the incubator, and it maintains a steady heat and humidity, and so that you can hatch all of your eggs. But if your electricity goes out, you've lost a batch of eggs. Or in order to account for the electricity loss, you use your generator, right? And that's very expensive. And so we calculated that local farmers could save $3,000 a year, right, compared to electric incubators. The other thing is, if your incubator, your electric incubator fails, then how do you fix it? And so a lot of people would just have incubators that were they just had to discard them because they didn't have the right tools. And so that's, again, why this idea of, for us, like locally built makes a lot of sense, because you're able to address some of those issues in terms of ensuring that you can actually repair this equipment. And so we can also think about energy, right, crucial at every step in the agri-food chain, right? And so whether it's irrigation, right, and solar, using solar for irrigation, we can think of solar drying, solar cold storage, all of these ways that we can think about along the agri-food chain that we need electricity. And so again, another way to ensure that we can have a clean energy transition is to think about how solar can be used, or it doesn't necessarily have to be solar, it can be other forms of renewable energy that could be used along this chain to ensure that we have proper food delivery. I think one of the largest problems is essentially food waste, right? And so people don't have the proper energy access to actually ensure that, to keep their food fresh. Okay, and just quickly, because I'm gonna leave a few minutes for questions. When we also think about energy, we also have to think about many people who are lacking clean cooking fuels. And this is where we start to see these gender disparities too. So a lot of women are the ones who are collecting the biomass. A lot of women are the ones who are actually doing the cooking, right? A lot of women are the ones who are inside using maybe kerosene. And as we know, that air pollution is a major cause of death. And so we see that is a major a concern about women spending a lot of time collecting biomass. And of course, also this leads to issues of deforestation, right? And so we see that smoke exposure is leading to premature death, right, from this biomass cooking. And so thinking about how to be able to actually convert some of these cooking methods into more clean cooking options. And we can see all of the different ways, from biomass to electricity to LPG, right, kerosene. What are the health impacts? What are the fuel costs, right? And so we're thinking about what are the trade-offs in terms of developing new methods around cooking, and particularly for women. And so we see biomass, coal, and kerosene, which are often used, that have the worst health impacts. And so there are a lot of people who are working on this issue in terms of thinking about clean cook stoves. And finally, I'll just say that global investment to 2030 for universal access to electricity falls short, but it's actually not a lot of money. And so we can think about, $725 billion could actually get us to universal access of electricity. These are often political decisions about whether or not people are going to invest, and it goes back to this idea of, profitability as well, and again, profitability versus a human right. And so that is a question also for, I think, the global financial institutions to really contemplate what makes more sense from a justice perspective again, energy is a human right. And we go back to this idea of energy histories, we understand that the global north has a responsibility in terms of the outcomes in the global south. And so if that is true from a justice perspective, then profitability should not necessarily be prioritized. It should be more of a human rights issue. And also, in my perspective, from a justice perspective, you're also thinking about climate change. And so if that is what we are concerned about, then it makes sense, right, that the returns on your investment is a better climate, is perhaps greater peace, right? And so, so these are some of the things that I think we really need to think about as we move forward and thinking about energy access in the global south. All right, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you.